It starts with a walk home from church, quiet, peaceful, ordinary, until a racist cop slams a 62-year-old woman against a brick wall, pressing his forearm to her throat for doing nothing more than existing with dignity. But what he doesn't know is she's not just anyone. She's the wife of a federal judge, and in just 5 seconds, her silence becomes a spotlight. His badge becomes a burden. And the entire city starts watching. What unfolds next is a powerful reckoning about race, power, and the quiet kind of strength that doesn't break even under pressure. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what moment hit you hardest. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe for more true stories that cut deep and stay with you. The church bells had just finished ringing, their echo lingering in the warm spring air like the final notes of a familiar hymn. Naomi Ellison stepped carefully down the wide stone steps of St. Mark's Baptist, her low-heeled shoes clicking softly with each step, one hand clutching a slim, leather-bound Bible, the other wrapped gently around a bouquet of white lilac tied with a pale blue ribbon. The Sunday crowd was slowly dispersing into the world, outside families hugging goodbye, children racing down the sidewalk, the quiet laughter of old friends folded into the rustling leaves overhead. Naomi moved differently from them, not hurried, not distracted, just steady and present, as if she carried her own atmosphere around her. She was dressed in a dark blue crepe dress that caught the sun without glaring, a silver brooch shaped like a dove resting just below her collarbone. Her gray hair was neatly twisted into a low bun at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place. Every year on this day, her wedding anniversary, she came to church alone, sat in the third pew from the front, lit a candle during the closing hymn, then walked 2 blocks home to cook dinner for 2. Even now, even with Jeremiah working late or traveling for hearings, she did it the same way, not for tradition, but for grounding, for memory. As she passed the wrought iron gate and stepped onto the sidewalk, she felt the slight breeze catch her dress, lifting its hem just enough to make her pause and tuck it gently back down. Magnolia trees lined the block, their blossoms fully open now, scenting the air with something sweet and faintly bitter, like childhood stories and old regrets. A pair of sparrows chirped overhead, as if announcing the hour. Naomi let out a quiet breath and began her walk, the lilac bobbing slightly with her stride. She didn't see the cruiser at first. Parked across the street, angled just enough to catch the whole block in view, but she felt it, the weight of attention, the static in the air. It wasn't new to her. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with sirens or shouts. It settled into her shoulders like humidity, like tension held in the jaw. Her eyes flicked sideways, then returned forward. She kept walking. "Not today," she whispered under her breath. More to herself than anyone listening, the car didn't move, but she could see the outline of a man inside. Driver's side elbow resting on the window frame, head tilted ever so slightly, watching. It was a white man, late 30s, maybe early 40s, short-cropped hair, no sunglasses, no phone in his hand, just stillness. And that particular kind of stillness that has nothing to do with peace. Naomi had seen it before in parking lots outside grocery stores. Once in a hospital waiting room, a stillness waiting to pounce. She adjusted her grip on the lilac, her knuckles tightening slightly without meaning to. Her mind began running through silent checklists. Was her ID in her purse? Was her phone charged? Had she locked the church gate behind her? She didn't panic. Panic never helped. She simply prepared. At the end of the block was the red brick library, and just beyond it, her home, a small white cottage with green shutters and a flagstone path Jeremiah had laid himself 30 years ago. She could already picture the porch light flicking on as the day dimmed, the wind chimes brushing gently against each other in the evening breeze. That's where she was headed. That was her right. But with each step, she felt the space around her narrow, as if the sidewalk had grown thinner or the trees had leaned in. She thought of something her mother used to say, soft and bitter like burnt coffee. "They don't need a reason, baby. Just the wrong moment and the right excuse." Naomi had spent her life disproving that sentence. She had become a principal. LED strict reforms, mentored young girls, served on community boards. She'd followed every rule, worn respect like a second skin. But some days, no matter how well you carried yourself, your skin walked into the room first. The cruiser door opened. She heard it before she saw it, that mechanical creak followed by the heavy slam of intention. Footsteps approached, not rushed but deliberate, like a man trying to be seen without seeming urgent. Naomi didn't turn around right away. She let him come closer. Let the sound of his boots on the pavement announce his presence. Let the quiet decide what this was going to be. "Ma'am," a voice called out, sharp, masculine, local. She turned slowly, her face neutral, neither smiling nor defensive. "Yes, officer," she said, calm and even. He was close now, maybe. 6 feet away, one hand near his utility belt, the other resting on the butt of his flashlight. His eyes went to the lily, then to the Bible, then to the brooch on her chest. He looked young enough to still have something to prove, but old enough to think he didn't. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Home," Naomi answered, "just 2 blocks up." "You come from church?" "I did," she said. "Is something wrong?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "You live around here?" Naomi met his gaze squarely. "I've lived on this block longer than you've been wearing that badge." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even defiance. It was just the truth spoken plainly, like a number recited from memory. But she saw something shift in his posture, just slightly, the way his shoulders squared, the way his jaw clicked once. And just like that, she knew this wasn't going to be about the lily or the Bible or the brooch. This was going to be about something much older, much heavier, and far harder to name. The officer stepped closer, his boots thudding with more weight than necessary. Each footfall a wordless warning wrapped in polished leather and pride. Naomi didn't move, not out of defiance, but because she knew the minute she did, raised a hand, stepped back, turned slightly, he'd interpret it as resistance, as guilt, as justification. He squinted slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line, scanning her face like it was a puzzle that didn't make sense to him. There was nothing outwardly aggressive in his stance, not yet. But Naomi had learned across decades to read the shifts in a man's breath before his tone changed, to hear what came next in the silence between words. "I need to see some ID." He said flatly, like it was protocol, like the situation required it. Naomi's voice remained steady. "Have I broken any laws, officer?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze flicked down to the lily in her hand, then the Bible, then to the narrow silver chain resting at the hollow of her throat. His jaw twitched. "We had a report of a woman matching your description, casing houses a few blocks over," he said, words tossed out like fishing hooks. "Hoping one might stick?" Naomi didn't flinch. "I've just come from church. I live on Hawthorne Street." "I'm heading home." "That's fine," he said, his tone tightening. "But I still need to verify." She nodded slowly, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement. "And do you ask every woman carrying flowers and scripture to verify where she belongs?" A flicker of something sharp passed through his eyes, something unspoken that tasted like insult. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the hem of her dress and pushing a curl of her gray hair across her cheek. Naomi reached up slowly, tucked it behind her ear, never taking her eyes off him. "What's your name?" he asked, more forcefully now. "Naomi Ellison," she answered calmly. He paused. The name registered, maybe not fully, maybe not yet, but something about it slowed him for half a second. Then he took a breath, squared his shoulders, and took a step closer. He was within arm's reach now, close enough for her to smell the faint trace of aftershave and sweat, close enough to see the tension building in the corners of his eyes. "I need you to stop walking and produce ID now," he said again, louder this time. Naomi didn't raise her voice. "I know my rights, officer. If you don't have reasonable suspicion, you have no legal grounds to detain me." The tension cracked in him then, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a frayed thread snapping in silence. His voice dropped, low and sharp. "You're refusing a lawful order." "I'm refusing to be harassed," she answered, her tone still even. "There's a difference." Around them, the street had gone strangely quiet. The chirping birds, the distant car engines, even the breeze seemed to hesitate. Across the street, a young couple holding hands slowed their walk. eyes drawn to the two figures on the sidewalk, their expressions wary but unsure. A man in a delivery van paused at the stop sign longer than necessary, glancing through his side mirror. No one intervened, but they were watching. The officer looked around, saw the attention growing, and instead of stepping back, he leaned into the pressure. His voice hardened. "Last warning, ma'am. Show me your identification." Naomi stood still, her fingers tight around the lila. Now, not from fear, but from something else, something older than fear? She had lived her life resisting the subtle erasers of dignity, had stood in rooms where she was the only one who looked like her, had smiled when she wanted to scream, had swallowed injustice like a daily pill. But this wasn't a closed door meeting, this was sunlight, this was her block. This was not the moment she would yield. "Then do what you feel you need to do," she said softly. "But understand this, I know exactly who I am." That sentence, those 10 words, did something to him. Without another word, without escalation, without protocol, he lunged. One hand grabbed her upper arm, fingers pressing into flesh with unnecessary force. The lila fell to the sidewalk like spilled truth. Naomi gasped, not from pain, but from the shock of how fast he turned. His other arm swung around her, and in one brutal motion, he shoved her backward and slammed her against the brick wall of the closed bookstore behind her. Her back hit first, then her shoulder, and she felt the rough texture scrape through the fabric of her dress. His forearm pressed across her throat, not choking, not completely, but just enough to take control, to erase distance, to threaten without drawing blood. The world slowed. Naomi's hands instinctively moved to his arm, not to push, not to fight, but to brace herself, to stay upright. Her face tilted slightly toward the sun, the late morning light catching the silver of her chain. Her eyes didn't close. She looked at him, right at him. Even with pressure on her windpipe, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "You don't get to do this," she said. "You're resisting," he barked. "I'm standing," she whispered. Cry rang out across the street, an older woman's voice sharp with disbelief. "Get your hands off her!" A phone camera clicked. Someone shouted, "She's not doing anything," but the officer didn't move. Naomi's breath came in short, uneven pulls now, her chest rising against his weight. Her knees trembled slightly, but she kept them locked, refused to give him the image of collapse. Behind her, the brick wall stayed cold and unmoving, an anchor and a prison. The lila at her feet had been crushed. The Bible had slid out of her purse and lay open to a psalm she hadn't read in years, a verse about enemies falling into their own traps. And somewhere inside her, beneath the pain, the fear, the helplessness, was something burning slow and bright. She wasn't crying, she wasn't pleading. She was waiting because she knew something he didn't, he wasn't. The only one who had been watching. The world didn't break open with noise. It cracked with silence, the kind that feels like pressure in the chest, a held breath stretched too long. Naomi remained pinned against the wall, her face tilted just enough to see the blur of faces across the street, gathering like clouds before a storm. A few people had begun to shout, but the officer, so close now she could see the tiny red vessels in his eyes, acted like their voices didn't exist, like he'd already convinced himself this wasn't excessive, wasn't personal, wasn't wrong. His jaw tightened with the kind of control that was always 1 inch away from collapse, and his grip across her collarbone made it clear he wanted to finish this before anyone intervened. She could feel the stone at her back digging into her spine, could feel her breath stutter inside her ribs, could feel her own silence becoming heavier than her words. Her vision blurred for just a second, not from pain or fear, but from the weight of it all. The decades of navigating rooms where she had to smile first, explain herself faster, forgive more quickly. She thought briefly of her students, girls, with thick hair and quick minds, who had once asked her if being good was ever enough. She had told them it was. But now, with her arms restrained and her voice dismissed, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. Then came the sound. It didn't scream through the street, it sliced it. The sudden screech of tires biting pavement, the bark of rubber against asphalt like a whip snapping across the afternoon calm. The officer flinched, barely, but Naomi felt it in the loosening of pressure against her throat. He turned his head, eyes narrowing toward the intersection. A black SUV had pulled up fast, its wheels hugging the curb as the engine cut abruptly. The crowd instinctively parted, some stepping back, others raising their phones higher, and then the door opened. Naomi Ellison stepped out without hesitation. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't come charging, like a hero in a movie. He walked slow, deliberate, with the kind of presence that didn't need an introduction. He wore a slate-gray suit jacket, unbuttoned, collar open, but it wasn't the clothes that turned heads. It was the way he carried himself, like the air had to move around him, not the other way around. At 6'3", with broad shoulders and a stare that had once silenced courtrooms mid-trial, Naomi didn't need to ask what was happening. He could see it all. Naomi, breathless and bruised, backed into brick. The officer, with his hands still raised, still unsure whether to let go or double down. And the onlookers, frozen between fear and hope. His voice, when it came, was measured steel. "Step away from my wife." The officer's spine straightened like a struck match. He turned fully now, hands slowly dropping from Naomi's shoulder, eyes flickering between the judge and the badge number on his own chest, as if trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. Naomi leaned against the wall for support, one hand at her side, the other pressing lightly against the spot where his arm had pinned her. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Naomi took one more step forward, his voice lower now, but firmer. "I said, step away from my wife." There was no hesitation in his tone, no negotiation, no room for misinterpretation. And for a moment, a small flickering moment, the street seemed to pause again. Even the birds in the trees above had gone quiet, their song stilled by something heavier than sound. The officer backed up one pace, then another, his face flushing red, his breath clipped with confusion and pride. Naomi watched it unfold with the quiet resolve of a woman who had always known this moment could come, not because she'd done something wrong, but because, eventually, they always tried to remind you of your place. Only this time she had someone who refused to forget hers. The officer opened his mouth, like he might say something, an excuse maybe, or a justification, but Naomi held up a hand, palm facing outward, calm as a signal flag. "Don't," he said, softer now. "You've already done more than enough." Around them the murmurs picked up again, low and scattered at first, then louder, more unified. "That's her husband," someone whispered. "Isn't he a judge?" A woman asked, clutching her purse tighter. A teenager with a live stream muttered, "Oh, he's about to lose his badge on camera." The shift in power was visible now, thick in the air like humidity before a summer storm. The officer, who had just minutes ago held a woman against a wall, was suddenly surrounded by judgment, not from authority above, but from truth unfolding all around him. Naomi turned toward Naomi, his voice dropping to something only she could hear. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly, her voice rasped but clear. "Not enough to matter." "But it could have been," he exhaled, a breath of both restraint and quiet fury. "I got here as fast as I could." "I know," she said, offering him the faintest nod, her hand brushing lightly against his. He looked back at the officer, now standing off to the side like a man unsure which way history was tilting. His hands were clenched, his lips tight, his eyes searching the sidewalk like maybe it held the answer to how everything had gone so wrong so fast. But Naomi knew better. It hadn't gone wrong fast. It had always been wrong. It just took 5 seconds and one voice to expose it. Naomi didn't rush forward, didn't crowd the man who had just shoved his wife against brick like she was an object, not a person. Instead, he closed the space slowly, each step measured like the beat of a gavel falling in a courtroom, the kind of deliberate movement that made you check your conscience before your next breath. The officer, name tag reading Doyle, had his hands free now, but the damage wasn't undone. Naomi was still catching her breath, her fingertips resting just beneath her collarbone like she was trying to anchor herself in the present moment. The crowd had thickened along the sidewalks edge, their phones held up like lighthouses, beams aimed at the truth so it couldn't disappear again. Naomi's voice didn't rise. He didn't need volume to make himself heard. "I want your name," he said. Your badge number, right now. His tone was flat and unshaken, like the words themselves carried weight no one could deflect. Doyle looked at him, jaw tight, eyes scanning the crowd, then back at Naomi, as if seeing her for the first time not as a stranger, but as someone connected, someone protected. But it was too late for revelation. This is a misunderstanding, Doyle said quickly, voice shaky at the edges, trying to catch up to the unraveling. No, Jeremiah replied, still calm, still unmoving. What just happened here was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice. One you made? Naomi shifted slightly against the wall, her posture straighter now, dignity intact despite everything that had been stripped away in the last few minutes. She didn't speak yet, not because she couldn't, but because she wanted to listen. To what her husband would say, to what he would choose to do with the fire in his chest. Jeremiah turned to her for just a second, his hand barely brushing hers. You okay? He asked under his breath. She nodded once. Don't hold back, she said quietly. Not today. Jeremiah turned back to Doyle. Do you know who you just put your hands on? He asked, not for effect, not as a threat, but because the question mattered. This woman has served this community longer than you've worn that badge. She has educated generations, mentored leaders, shown up when this city didn't deserve her. And you? He took one breath, deep and cold. You assaulted her because you didn't like the way she walked. Doyle opened his mouth, then closed it again, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. The crowd had grown braver now. Someone sighed, tell him who she is. Another added, we've got the whole thing on video. A woman near the back murmured, it's always this way until someone important's watching. Jeremiah's voice dropped even lower. You didn't ask questions. You made assumptions, you didn't de-escalate, you escalated. And for what? A necklace? A skin tone? A woman who didn't bow her head. The silence was thunderous. From across the street, a police sergeant had arrived, black woman, mid-40s, calm eyes, and a badge gleaming under the sun. She walked slowly toward the scene, nodding to those in the crowd with the familiarity of someone who knew which side of the street her roots were on. Everything all right here? She asked, voice steady, gaze landing on Doyle. Jeremiah stepped aside, gave her room. This officer here, he said, pointing to Doyle without raising his hand, put his hands on my wife without provocation, slammed her into that wall, threatened her. You tell me, does that sound like procedure to you? The sergeant's face didn't shift much, but her eyes cooled. Is that accurate, Officer Doyle? She refused to comply, he answered, voice thinning. She matched a report. Did you see her commit a crime? Jeremiah interrupted, stepping back just enough to draw the crowd in tighter. Did you see her run? Did you hear her threaten you, resist you, or raise a hand? Or did you just not like that she didn't look scared of you? Naomi finally spoke, her voice low but clear. He didn't see me at all, just the version of me he wanted to believe. A wave of murmurs passed through the crowd like a current. The sergeant glanced at Naomi, then at Jeremiah, then at the foams. Her nod was slow. We'll be handling this, she said quietly to Jeremiah. I suggest you file a complaint immediately. We will, Naomi said. But let me be very clear, this doesn't end with paperwork. Jeremiah looked at Doyle one last time, not with rage, but with something deeper, heavier disappointment. That men like this still existed in uniforms meant to protect. You assaulted the wrong woman, he said, and you're about to learn what that means. Doyle stood stiffly, his hands clenched, his mouth tight as the sergeant pulled him aside. His voice had no place left to go. No one was listening now. The power he'd clung to with force and threat had dissolved in the air. Choked by truth, by witness, by the unshakable presence of consequence, Naomi stepped forward, brushing her dress with one hand, smoothing out wrinkles that hadn't come from fabric, but from insult. She turned to her husband and nodded once. Let's go, she said, her voice still strong. I've got Lila to replace. They walked side by side, past the gathered crowd, past the crushed bouquet and the fallen Bible, past the man who thought power lived in his badge instead of his integrity. And as they passed, people made space not because they were afraid, But because they finally saw clearly who she was, and who she had always been, the air outside the station that evening felt heavier than the heat could explain, like the entire city was holding its breath, waiting to see whether justice was something whispered in private or spoken aloud with the lights on. Naomi sat quietly beside Jeremiah on their porch, the soft creak of the rocking chair beneath her keeping time with the thoughts moving through her chest. The bruises on her shoulder had begun to surface, faint shadows beneath the skin, more tender than she wanted to admit. But it wasn't the ache in her bones that stayed with her. It was the way the officer's eyes had shifted when he realized who she was. Like her humanity only mattered once it was attached to a name. He recognized Jeremiah had barely spoken since they got home, and Naomi didn't press. Some silences were not empty, they were full of restraint, full of strategy. He sat with his elbows on his knees, his wedding band catching the last streaks of sunlight. She could feel his anger low, controlled, and simmering, not the kind that sought revenge, but the kind that refused to go numb again. "You still thinking about what you're going to say?" she asked finally, her voice gentle but grounded. "I'm thinking about how long I've stayed quiet," he answered, not looking up. "How many times I'd told myself to wait for the right moment." Naomi nodded slowly, her hand resting on the arm of her chair. "And now?" he exhaled. "Now I'm wondering if every moment we waited just let them believe they were right." The cicadas had begun their chorus in the distance, a constant electric hum beneath the sounds of evening distant traffic, a neighbor's screen door slamming, the faint cry of a baby down the block. Naomi looked out toward the street where it all had happened, where her back had met brick and her dignity had been tested in front of strangers. The footage was already online, shared, clipped, reposted, her name trending in places she hadn't yet seen. She hadn't watched it, not yet, she didn't need to. She remembered every frame in her body. Inside the house, the phone rang again, then again. Jeremiah had stopped answering. The messages kept piling up, colleagues, reporters, old friends, even enemies pretending concern. Everyone had something to say now that the truth had made its way to daylight. But truth, Naomi thought, was not enough. It had to be carried, protected, amplified. It had to be more than a moment. "I don't want this to just fade," she said softly. "I don't want it to become another headline that disappears by Monday." Jeremiah turned toward her, finally meeting her eyes. "It won't. Not if we hold it, not if we own it." They sat in silence for a while longer, letting the words settle the way dust does after a long drive down a dirt road. And then, quietly, Naomi stood. She walked into the house, pulled her notebook from the hallway drawer, and returned with a pen already uncapped. She sat beside him again, flipped to a clean page, and began to write. "What's that?" he asked, watching the curve. "Of her letters, names," she said. "People I want in the room. Pastors, teachers, journalists who don't just chase clicks. Elders who still remember what organizing feels like. I'm not waiting for permission, Jeremiah. I'm planning," he smiled, not wide, but real. "You always did like being 10 steps ahead." "You always made me walk alone to get there," she replied. With just enough teasing to cut through the weight of the day, he leaned over and kissed her temple, his lips lingering just long enough. "Not this time." By the time the sky turned purple, the city had already begun to change, not on the surface, not in the streets, but in the way people spoke to each other, in the way strangers nodded when passing, in the way stories traveled. Across kitchen tables and front porches, Naomi had become a name people knew. But more than that, she had become a mirror. And what people saw reflected was themselves, wounded, enduring, still standing at the precinct. Things were already shifting. Officer Doyle had been pulled off duty pending review, but rumors spread. Like spilled ink. Some officers said he'd been made a scapegoat. Others said he got exactly what he deserved. A few quietly admitted they'd seen him cross the line before. Jeremiah knew that whatever came next wouldn't be about just one man. It would be about a culture, a silence, a permission structure that too often allowed harm and expected no consequence. That night, as Naomi sat at the dining table, jotting notes under the glow of a single lamp, Jeremiah paced the hallway with a phone to his ear. He spoke calmly, but the lines in his forehead stayed deep. He was calling leaders judges, civil rights attorneys, council members people who understood that justice wasn't just an idea, but a structure, something that needed rebuilding from the inside out. Naomi listened with one ear, her pen still, moving, her heart beating steady. She thought of her students again, now grown, scattered across the country, watching this unfold on their screens. She wondered if they recognized the same voice in her now that had once called them to their potential. She hoped so. "Naomi," Jeremiah said from the doorway, "they want a statement in the morning." She looked up, not flinching. "Then we give them one, not to defend ourselves, but to declare what comes next," he nodded. "Together," she smiled, "always." And with that she stood again, walked to the front door, opened it, and looked out into the night. The porch light flickered once, then held steady. Somewhere down the block, someone was still awake, watching from their window. Naomi didn't wave, but she stood there long enough to be seen, bruised, yes, but unbroken. And the city, even in its silence, felt like it was listening. By the time the sun rose over the courthouse steps, there was already a small crowd gathered, some standing in quiet clusters, others seated on the low stone benches with coffee cups clutched between steady hands. The morning air smelled like raw determination and fresh ink, like something old had finally been broken open to make room for something new. Naomi stood near the entrance, beneath the tall columns, dressed in a simple gray suit, her brooch polished, her posture unshaken. She wasn't there to be the center of anything, but the gravity around her said otherwise. Jeremiah stood beside her, tie already loosened, his hand brushing gently against hers, a silent signal that, no matter what came next, they were walking through it together. Reporters lined the walk like sentries, microphones held out like confessions, waiting to be heard, their voices muffled under the weight of the moment. Naomi didn't stop for questions. She didn't look for cameras. She stepped inside the courthouse as if it were her own living room, because dignity, when earned, doesn't flinch in the face of scrutiny. The courtroom itself was packed. Activists, clergy, city workers, students with notebooks. They filled the pews like it was Sunday morning. The judge entered, the bailiff called the room to order, and the air seemed to tighten in every corner. The officer, Doyle, sat across the aisle, shoulders hunched, eyes low. The bravado from that day long. His uniform was gone too. In its place, a stiff gray suit that didn't quite fit, like he was playing a part he no longer believed in. His lawyer whispered often, but he barely responded, lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. Naomi watched him, not out of anger, but out of something quieter and more devastating, the knowledge that he had believed, truly believed, she was small enough to be crushed without consequence. The trial moved swiftly, not because it was easy, but because the evidence had already spoken before anyone entered the room. Video footage from multiple angles played in silence, only the soft hum of the screen filling the space. As the jury watched Naomi be shoved, heard her voice break, saw the crowd begin to rally, and witnessed the moment Jeremiah stepped into the frame, the room held its breath. Witnesses testified, some from the crowd, others from within the police department itself. A former colleague of Doyle said, "We knew he had a problem with power. We just stopped looking." That line landed like a hammer. When Naomi took the stand, the room went still, not just with attention, but with reverence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke like someone who had walked this road 1,000 times. In silence, and finally decided the world needed to hear her shoes hit the pavement. "I wasn't attacked because of what I did," she said plainly. "I was attacked because of what he saw when he looked at me. And if that isn't enough to bring us here, then why even have a courtroom?" When the verdict came back liable for assault, misconduct, and civil rights violations, no one cheered, no one clapped. It was the kind of justice that didn't taste sweet, only necessary. Naomi closed her eyes and let out a long, quiet breath, not of victory, but of release. Doyle sat still, jaw trembling, the reality of his downfall finally settling into the empty space where his certainty used to live. Outside, the steps were more crowded now, the sun casting long shadows behind every conversation. Naomi stepped to the podium, cameras snapping again, but her gaze never wandered from the people. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said. "It's about what we allow to happen to people who don't get cameras, who don't have someone show up in time. This is a promise not to be silent again." From there, the change didn't explode, it unfolded. In the weeks that followed, Jeremiah led a formal review of all use-of-force complaints in the department. A community oversight board was established, and Naomi was asked to chair its first session. Some officers resigned quietly. Others stayed and listened for the first time. Body cam policies were rewritten, training restructured, civilian reports unsealed for public view. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. At the first town hall, Naomi stood under string lights on a school stage, surrounded by neighbors who had once whispered their fears in private. She held the same notebook she'd started on the porch that night and read out a list of changes already implemented. Then she closed it, looked out over the crowd, and asked simply, "What do you want your city to feel like when your child walks down the street?" A woman in the back stood slowly, her voice shaking. "Safe. I want it to feel safe again," Naomi nodded. "Then let's make sure it's not just a feeling. Let's make it law." She walked home that night, past the wall where it all began. Someone had left fresh lilies there, wrapped in brown paper, tied with a blue ribbon. She didn't stop to pick them up. She simply smiled, touched the stone with 2 fingers, and kept walking because the reckoning had begun. And now, finally, it belonged to everyone. What happened to Naomi Ellison wasn't just an isolated act of cruelty. It was a mirror held up to a system that too often confuses power with righteousness and silence with order. But Naomi's story reminds us that dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. Her strength didn't come from shouting louder, but from standing firmer. And her husband's quiet authority didn't erupt in anger, it arrived with clarity, principle, and unwavering love. For many of us, especially those who've lived long enough to remember other struggles, this story stirs something deep. We remember the marsh, the courtrooms, the unspoken sacrifices made on porches and in pews. Naomi's courage calls us back to that place, not to dwell in the pain, but to reclaim our voice in the present. Because what's at stake isn't justice for one person, it's the kind of world we leave behind for our children and their children. So, if this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or even remember, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who still believes in quiet strength, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that honor resilience, expose injustice, and uplift the power of everyday people. Let's not just witness the truth, let's carry it forward together. Thanks for staying until the end. If this story gripped you, like, share, and subscribe. Justice Unraveled for more stories, justice, crime, and mysteries that refuse to stay buried.